Welcome to another journey through the forgotten corridors of time, my fellow travelers in history. Before we step into the shadowed abbeys and dust-covered paths of medieval Europe, I'd love to know where you find yourself listening tonight. Perhaps you're settling in after a long day, with rain softly tapping your windows. Or maybe you're on the other side of the globe, welcoming a new dawn with questions about the distant past. Whatever led you here, I'm thankful to have your company as we uncover one of history's most compelling and troubling traditions tonight. We explore a practice rooted in devotion but often marred by suffering. A sacred expedition that began in hope and faith, but too often ended in illness, hardship, and death. This is the story of medieval pilgrimage, supposedly holy journeys to distant shrines and sacred sites that evolved into something far darker. They were presented as spiritual missions, but for many, they became deadly odysseys cloaked in religious purpose. Picture the countryside of 12th century England. The morning fog clings to the hills like the veil between worlds, and the bells of Canterbury ring across the Kentish fields, calling the faithful to prayer. Yet these bells summon more than the nearby villagers. They call to the pilgrims. For generations, pilgrimage was deeply interwoven with Christian life. To journey to a sacred site, to revere the remains of saints, to ask for healing or forgiveness, these weren't merely encouraged acts of faith, but essential duties for the devout. The roads to Canterbury, Rome, and Santiago de Compostela in Spain echoed with the footsteps of those seeking divine mercy. But what began as spiritual devotion slowly took on another character. The medieval pilgrimage, once a path toward grace, became a dangerous crossroads of physical hardship, greed, and exploitation. The same roads that were supposed to lead the faithful to salvation often delivered them into misery. This transformation was subtle, unfolding slowly over decades. Like many of history's tragedies, it crept in unnoticed until the sacred had been overtaken by something far more worldly. What once offered spiritual hope now often promised only physical risk and sometimes death. To grasp the scale, consider that by the peak of the Middle Ages, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims were traveling Europe's roads each year. From peasants to nobility, people left home driven by faith, desperation, or motives harder to define. Some sought miraculous cures for illnesses beyond the reach of medieval medicine. Others hoped to atone for great sins. Many simply joined the masses, caught up in a wave of spiritual excitement sweeping across the land. But the world they entered was harsh and unforgiving. Roads were often no more than muddy trails, made worse by rain or snow. Bridges, if they existed, were fragile or broken. Shelters were scarce, and those that did exist, like roadside inns, were sometimes filthy, disease-ridden, or run by people with less than holy intentions. To leave your home in medieval Europe is to step into a world where death could await at every turn. What made this descent into danger so devastating was how it intertwined with the very structures of power and belief. The Church, which had once promoted pilgrimage as an act of piety, soon realized it was also a means to something else: influence, wealth, and control. Shrines became lucrative enterprises. Relics were transformed into spiritual merchandise. And the promise of redemption became a service that could be bought if one could afford the price. As the pilgrimage economy grew, so did the risks for those who participated. Pilgrims, often sincere but ill-prepared for the journey, were easy targets. Bandits patrolled well-traveled routes, aware that these travelers might carry life savings in coins or valuables. Innkeepers could be untrustworthy, offering food laced with sleeping herbs to rob unsuspecting guests, and local officials along the way imposed harsh tolls, bribes, or taxes on those trying to pass. Perhaps most disheartening were the institutions that claimed to serve the pilgrims' spiritual needs. Monasteries, which were supposed to offer refuge, began charging high prices for meager food and lodging. Clergy sold false relics, bones of saints that were more likely animal remains. And some priests even urged the poorest and weakest to embark on pilgrimages they could never survive, claiming it was God's will. In truth, it was often about filling coffers, The records that survive reveal just how dangerous these journeys could be, and some historians suggest that up to 1 in 4 pilgrims who left for far-off shrines never returned. Illness was rampant, as many traveled malnourished, exposed to the elements. Violence took its toll: muggings, murders, or simply getting lost and dying far from home. And some disappeared entirely, their fate unknown, their families left with unanswered prayers and unburied grief. What we see here isn't just a tale of death on the road. It's the corruption of something deeply human, the desire for meaning. Pilgrimage at its heart was about the soul's search for forgiveness, for healing, for purpose. But when that search passed through the hands of institutions more focused on profit than piety, it became distorted. This distortion didn't just claim lives, it degraded a practice that should have lifted the human spirit. Faith turned into transaction, hope into manipulation, and the sacred into something dangerously close to exploitation. In tonight's journey through this darker history, we'll look more closely at how this transformation occurred. We'll meet individuals who shaped it, those who profited, and those who suffered. We'll walk the treacherous roads that cut through forests and mountains, and visit the shrines that once glittered with promise, but now tell a more sobering tale. And we'll explore how medieval people themselves began to realize that something once holy had lost its way. This isn't a story filled with easy villains. Medieval life was uncertain and brutal. Many clergy who encouraged pilgrimage truly believed it was righteous. Many victims believed their hardships were part of divine testing. And it's exactly this mix of faith and suffering that makes the story so powerful and so relevant. Because in the story of how medieval pilgrimages became death traps, we find themes that still echo today. The exploitation of belief, the monetization of the sacred, the vulnerability of those searching for meaning in a confusing world. So sit back. Let the calm of your present-day surroundings ease your mind, and prepare to step with me into a time when the road to salvation was anything but safe, and the cost of faith could be counted not just in coin, but in lives lost. And when the very institutions meant to guide the soul risked becoming the ones that led it astray. By the 13th century, the transformation was complete. What had started as a holy journey had become, for many, a perilous obligation. Feudal lords weren't satisfied simply collecting crops or labor. They demanded pilgrimages too, seeing them as a way to assert religious control and social status. The journey itself had become an expectation, one that funneled power upward and risk downward. Monasteries, once beacons of shelter, now resembled toll booths, charging travelers for every step. Holy men, who should have offered comfort, insisted on larger donations, sometimes suggesting that the state of one's soul depended on payment. The most renowned pilgrimage paths became controlled by networks of officials and landlords who found opportunity in spiritual desperation. What once uplifted had become a machine efficient, profitable, and perilous. Too many within the system, pilgrims were no longer seen as fellow Christians in pursuit of salvation, but as easy targets carrying coins and blind trust. Consider Brother Thomas of Winchester. His carefully kept ledgers from 1267 revealed the stark economics behind what was presented as charity. His monastery charged travelers triple the usual cost for a bowl of thin soup and bread. Well aware that options were non-existent in the surrounding wilderness, those who couldn't pay were turned away, sometimes left to perish just within sight of the abbey's gates. His records boast over 2,000 pilgrims served annually, yet less than two-thirds were ever recorded leaving to continue their journey. The fate of the rest, ominously absent from his detailed notes. This sort of exploitation didn't end with one monastery. Entire webs of local officials worked in coordination to profit from the faithful. Tolls at bridges inexplicably spiked. During peak pilgrimage seasons, roadside inns, rather than offering refuge, served adulterated drinks that left guests unconscious and vulnerable to theft. Some guides would lead pilgrims directly into ambushes set up by bandits, taking a share of the loot in return. Sheriffs who should have upheld the law were instead known to accept bribes to ignore reports of missing travelers. One of the most manipulative schemes, came from merchants peddling false relics. These sellers capitalized on pilgrims' most profound spiritual hopes, offering bits of wood said to be from the true cross, or water from the river Jordan, or bones falsely claimed to be from saints. These objects, presented with solemn oaths and staged rituals, were entirely worthless. But poor pilgrims, emotionally exhausted and spiritually desperate, would part with their last coins in the belief that they were securing divine favor. When the deception eventually surfaced, the sellers had long since disappeared, leaving broken trust in their wake. The shift from pilgrimage as sacred commitment to commercial machinery created a perfect environment for abuse. Most pilgrims truly believed that visiting holy places would absolve sins and ensure a place in heaven. This sincerity made them not only willing, but even eager to endure hardships and financial strain. Those in power knew this mindset well and used it. By stoking religious urgency, they suppressed logic, making travelers vulnerable to inflated prices, false promises, and outright exploitation. Despite the reverent tones used to describe pilgrimage, at the time the reality was much grimmer. Death tolls among pilgrims were staggeringly high, though rarely discussed by the authorities who benefited. Modern estimates suggest that during peak seasons, as many as 30 to 40% of pilgrims perished before reaching their destination or on the return trip. That's a higher mortality rate than many medieval battles, and these weren't soldiers. These were civilians, farmers, mothers, widowers, seeking hope, not war. The corruption took its most institutional form in the sale of indulgences tied directly to pilgrimage routes. Church officials began to promise shortened time in purgatory for those who visited specific shrines, but only if they made designated donations at each stop. It turned the road to salvation into a long and costly subscription plan, where grace came in increments, depending on how much one could afford to give at each checkpoint along the way. For women, the perils of pilgrimage extended even further. Besides facing the same financial traps and physical dangers as men, female pilgrims were vulnerable to gender-based abuses that were quietly ignored by those in power. Cases were recorded of innkeepers offering shelter in exchange for coercive favors, of guides abandoning women in isolated areas, and of religious officials abusing their authority under the guise of offering protection. While church doctrine officially condemned such behavior, very little was done to stop it. In many cases, the institutions that profited from pilgrimage chose silence over justice. Geographic isolation only deepened the problem. Once pilgrims left behind the relative safety of cities and entered long stretches of countryside, they were at the mercy of whoever controlled the roads. This allowed unscrupulous service providers to charge outrageous sums for food, shelter, and passage, confident that travelers had no other options. Turning back meant forfeiting both money already spent and what many saw as their one chance. At spiritual redemption, even the layout of pilgrimage routes often reflected profit more than piety. Instead of guiding pilgrims along safe or direct paths, official roads were deliberately mapped to pass through areas where church allies and toll collectors operated. These winding detours could add weeks to the journey, increasing exposure to disease, weather, and robbery, while also ensuring a steady stream of income for the corrupt networks behind the scenes. Psychological manipulation was another tool in this vast system. Church representatives didn't only collect fees, they cultivated anxiety. Confessors along the routes were trained not just to hear scenes, but to gauge spiritual vulnerability. The more guilt a pilgrim expressed, the more remedies were suggested, usually involving costly offerings or additional detours to specific shrines. What was supposed to be a process of healing became one of intensified fear and financial desperation. Documents from the period confirm how intentional this was. Monastic records show price hikes that precisely aligned with known pilgrimage festivals. Toll logs reveal coordinated fee increases across neighboring regions during high-traffic seasons. Even emergency shelters saw opportunity when bad weather struck. They doubled prices or refused to assist those who couldn't pay. The medical aspect of pilgrimage, ironically, only worsened the suffering. Far from offering healing, many of the supposed miracle sites became centers for the spread of infectious disease. Crowded, unsanitary, and filled with weakened individuals, these sites created ideal conditions for outbreaks. Unscrupulous healers seized on this desperation by selling remedies that ranged from useless to dangerous, all at a high price. These cures often worsened the very illnesses they were meant to alleviate, with dying pilgrims spending their final coins on false hope. What makes this history so devastating isn't just the suffering, it's the betrayal. The core values of Christianity, compassion, hospitality, care for the vulnerable, were inverted. Pilgrimage, which should have embodied the highest ideals of spiritual service, became a mechanism for extracting wealth from the most desperate. The Church, in many regions, failed not because it lacked awareness, but because it had grown too entwined with the prophets to act against the abuses. By the dawn of the 15th century, the damage was done. What had begun as heartfelt devotion had been reshaped into a sprawling and efficient industry of misery. Entire communities existed to serve the pilgrimage economy, might have been by draining it, and for every shrine that inspired awe, there were others whose gilded altars had been funded by the misfortune of the poor. Some individuals tried to resist. One notable case was Brother Uldrich of Canterbury. Reviewing internal travel records, he discovered that his abbey had been deliberately directing pilgrims along longer, more hazardous routes where affiliated vendors and hostels could maximize profit from extended stays. Shocked by this manipulation, Uldrich threatened to report the scheme to church authorities. Shortly afterward, embarked on a pilgrimage to Romand, never returned. Only his belongings were later found near a cliffside trail. The official story blamed an accident, but his disappearance mirrored similar incidents. Uldrich became one of many whistleblowers lost to time. By the late 1300s, such practices had become refined and widespread. Networks of abbeys, innkeepers, toll collectors, merchants functioned almost like corporations coordinating routes, prices, and access. The religious language remained unchanged, but the spirit behind the pilgrimage had been hollowed out. Pilgrimage sites increasingly became death traps, holy in name only, but deadly in reality. Many remote shrines were purposefully established in regions known for danger areas plagued by bandits, severe weather, or recurring illness. Ironically, the greater the risk involved in reaching a site, the more spiritual benefit the Church claimed it could provide. The logic was chilling. The more a pilgrim suffered, the more their soul supposedly gained. And so, danger was repackaged as divine opportunity. Even more unsettling was the psychological dimension of this manipulation. Church scribes crafted intricate and entirely fictional biographies of saints, complete with dramatic miracles and relics that appealed directly to the emotional vulnerabilities of the faithful. These stories were designed to tug at the hearts of the desperate. Parents of sick children, for example, were told that the remains of St. Cordelia, capable of miraculous healing, lay in a pestilent marsh, 3 weeks' journey from any major village. Childless women heard tales of a holy girdle said to bless fertility, stored in a monastery deep within bandit-patrolled forests, and accessible only after paying steep tribute fees. This system created something more harmful than isolated scams. It formed an economy of desperation. When a pilgrimage failed to deliver the expected miracle, clergy would blame the outcome on the pilgrim's supposed lack of faith. The proposed solution: second pilgrimage, more expensive and more dangerous than the last. Records from the monastery of St. Dunstan show families selling homes, livestock, and in some tragic cases, entering their children into indentured service just to fund these repeated quests for healing and redemption. Buried within sealed church archives and forgotten libraries, statistics from this period suggest staggering levels of mortality. A document found in the ruins of Glastonbury Abbey indicates that death rates along certain routes exceeded 60%. One such path, ominously named the Route of Seven Sorrows, linked shrines across the rugged landscapes of northern England and Scotland. Locals grimly referred to it as the widow's path because so many husbands, fathers, and sons never returned. And yet, these routes remained in use, promoted heavily by church authorities who pointed to the death toll not as a warning, but as validation of the path's divine power. The more difficult the road, they said, the more sacred the reward. Perhaps the most chilling discovery by modern scholars is what's now known as the Martyr's Ledger. This document, found hidden among the remains of a monastery, library cataloged pilgrim deaths alongside detailed profit calculations. Each entry listed purchases made by the deceased, trellics, food, lodgings, and, in many cases, the fees for burial services paid by mourning families. The most profitable cases were marked with small crosses, indicating which routes and practices yielded the highest returns. These were not records of compassion. They were spreadsheets for expanding a deadly business model. This wasn't merely exploitation. It was a well-oiled system that turned faith into revenue and suffering into a commodity. Pilgrims who left home believing they were walking towards spiritual enlightenment were, in reality, financing a vast enterprise that viewed their demise as a cost of doing business. The church, shrouded in authority and tradition, kept this machinery running for decades, carefully shielding it from scrutiny behind holy language and complex rituals. Only centuries later did the full extent of this tragedy come to light, as historians slowly pieced together fragments of suppressed or forgotten records. By then, untold thousands had already perished on what may well have been the most successful and insidious manipulation scheme of the medieval era, one that transformed humanity's deepest spiritual aspirations into instruments of institutional control. This wasn't just a case of inflated prices or dishonest relic sellers. The most dangerous aspect was the deliberate cultivation of desperation. The system didn't merely take advantage of suffering, it manufactured it, nurtured it, and built an economy around it. Clerics of the era understood something profound about human psychology. People in pain will give anything, sacrifice everything for even a sliver of hope. And pain was everywhere. In medieval Europe, life was brutal. Waves of disease regularly swept through villages. The Black Death alone wiped out nearly a third of the continent's population, reducing vibrant towns to ghostly remnants and leaving behind a trauma few could comprehend. Chronic illness, physical injuries, malnutrition, and untreated ailments were the norm. Child mortality rates soared above 50%. Mothers routinely died in childbirth. The average villager, if lucky, might live to see 30, most of it spent in relentless toil and worry. Into this bleak world, the church offered an answer: pilgrimage. Not one choice among many, but the highest form of devotion. It wasn't just recommended, it was exalted. Through sermons, stories, and public proclamations, pilgrimage was framed as the ultimate expression of faith. And not just any pilgrimage, long, costly, painful journeys. The more one suffered, the greater the spiritual return. Hardship was proof of sincerity. Endurance was evidence of worthiness. This teaching had dire consequences. Rather than encouraging safer, more accessible forms of worship like local prayer, charity, or communal service, the church actively discouraged them, or at best treated them as spiritually inferior. Only by leaving everything behind and venturing into danger could one prove true devotion. The message was unambiguous. If you genuinely loved God, if you truly wanted salvation or healing, you would take the journey regardless of the cost. The stories spread to reinforce this belief were carefully curated. Tales of miraculous recoveries were almost always linked to the most difficult and expensive routes. Lepers were said to be cured at Santiago de Compostela after months of suffering. Blind children, it was claimed, regained their sight at Canterbury only after their families had sold every possession to get there. These accounts circulated widely, building a culture in which pilgrimage wasn't just admired, but expected. And when miracles didn't occur, the answer was always the same. The pilgrims' faith hadn't been strong enough, their sacrifice not great enough. This narrative left the faithful caught in a relentless cycle. Those who failed felt guilt, and guilt required redemption, which meant another journey, another offering, another chance. Meanwhile, the church continued to present itself as a benevolent guide, even as its institutions grew increasingly dependent on the wealth generated by these doomed expeditions. The farther a shrine, the higher its perceived value. The harder the road, the more sacred it was said to be. Every danger, every hardship was rebranded as a spiritual test. Behind it all, the machinery of profit turned sterile. They told the poor that giving alms was noble, but if suffering continued, it was because their devotion had not gone far enough. Only pilgrimage, they said, demonstrated true submission, like simple prayers or local charity. Pilgrimage demanded everything: wealth, comfort, time, and often life itself. It was presented as the highest form of penance, the ultimate spiritual investment, with the ultimate divine return. The Church carefully shaped this narrative using the medieval understanding of sin and purification. They taught that sin accumulated like an invisible debt, burdening the soul and blocking God's grace. Ordinary acts of goodness might lessen the weight slightly, but only pilgrimage, especially too distant, dangerous, and costly destinations could erase it completely. This idea of spiritual bankruptcy, followed by total absolution, held powerful appeal for people already grappling with guilt and fear. Parents watching their children fall ill were told their own hidden sins had caused the sickness. Farmers, facing years of failed harvests, blamed divine punishment. Merchants enduring ruin believed they'd lost God's favor. And always the suggested solution was the same: go on pilgrimage. Walk away from your home, your safety, and everything you own to prove your worthiness to God. But perhaps the most emotionally devastating manipulation was the Church's use of vicarious pilgrimage, the belief that one person's journey could secure divine favor for someone else. This idea meant that if a loved one was suffering, the solution might not be their own actions but yours. A father would leave his family and walk hundreds of miles to gain forgiveness for a child. A young man might risk death on the road to heal his mother. The emotional stakes were enormous, and the Church knew it. Clergy would visit homes not only to offer prayers, but to subtly plant the idea that a pilgrimage was a necessary act of love. They spoke of miraculous healings that followed great personal sacrifice. They described other families who had risked everything and been rewarded. The implication was never stated outright, but it didn't need to be. If you truly cared for your loved ones, you would go. And these weren't private burdens. In tightly knit medieval communities, where public image meant everything, the pressure grew unbearable. A family that refused pilgrimage for a dying child might face quiet condemnation. From neighbors, they were labeled as unfaithful, even cruel. No one wanted to be the subject of whispers during Sunday Mass. Reputation and shame were weaponized as tools of persuasion. Timing, too, was used with surgical precision. Church officials often made their appeals during moments of greatest emotional distress. When a mother clutched a feverish child or a husband watched his wife decline, they'd be told of sacred springs and miracle-working relics far away. At such moments, logic gave way to desperation. The promise of healing, however remote, became irresistible. An endless stream of pilgrims, many of whom could neither afford the journey nor survive it. Entire families would liquidate their lives selling homes, animals, heirlooms, just to send one member down a path they hoped led to salvation. These travelers set off burdened with hope and crushed by expectation. They carried not just bags, but the emotional weight of their family's futures. Behind the scenes, this system worked with cold precision. The Church had created a mechanism that turned human suffering into revenue. Desperation became currency, and the desire to help others was re-engineered as a means of self-destruction. They had taken humanity's most natural instinct, the will to protect loved ones, and turned it into a trap, one that operated smoothly, profitably, and for centuries. The true horror of this system wasn't just the toll in lives or coins. It was the psychological manipulation that made the victims believe they had chosen their path freely. They weren't forced to suffer. They were led to believe that suffering was sacred. This shift from voluntary devotion to organized one of the darkest evolutions in medieval history. What began as an expression of faith became an industrial-scale extraction of pain. As the Church's psychological grip grew tighter, a new economy emerged, one not based on agriculture or trade, but on fear and guilt. By the time the late medieval period arrived, pilgrimage was no longer a choice. It was mandated, institutionalized, and weaponized. What had once been a deeply personal act of spiritual commitment became a punishment handed down by courts. Pilgrimage sentences were issued like verdicts. For crimes both real and invented, people were condemned to journeys everyone knew they might not survive. The destinations told the story. Early pilgrims might have walked a few miles to a local chapel, but now the church insisted that true absolution required travel to Rome, to Jerusalem, to Santiago de Compostela, journeys that could take years and cross some of the most treacherous terrain known to man. The financial demands were crushing. A pilgrimage to the Holy Land could cost a common laborer the equivalent of 10 years of wages. To afford the trip, families would sell property, livestock, even future labor. Generations were mortgaged to pay for one person's attempt at spiritual redemption. The church didn't hide these costs, it sanctified them. The more one gave up, the more meaningful the sacrifice. And in a world where suffering was a daily reality, people came to believe that the only way to salvation was through more suffering. This was the true genius of the system. It didn't need to use force. It made the people enforce it themselves. Entire societies came to believe that pain was necessary for peace, and that only through physical and emotional agony could one prove devotion. In this twisted theology, hardship became holy. Every blister, every hunger pang, every mile of danger was reinterpreted as evidence of piety, and if a pilgrim died along the way, that too was framed as a blessing. Their death was seen not as a tragedy, but as a glorious martyrdom, a final offering to God. The routes themselves reflected this belief. Instead of building safer paths or establishing trustworthy shelters, the church leaned into risk. They promoted routes that passed through snowy mountain passes, blazing deserts, and pirate-infested seas, not in spite of the danger, but because of it. Each added peril was spun as a spiritual opportunity. Cold, heat, hunger, and illness weren't inconveniences. They were signs that the journey was working. In this way, the entire structure of pilgrimage was re-engineered to inflict the maximum amount of pain while extracting the maximum amount of value. What emerged was a system so efficient in its cruelty, so complete in its control, that it operated for centuries almost without challenge. The church had turned faith into a tool for domination, love into leverage, and hope into a product to be sold. Pilgrims boarded ships barely fit to sail, risking their lives on open waters riddled with storms, pirates, and disease. Every danger, every hardship, was rebranded as holy struggle. A capsized boat became a test of faith, a drowned pilgrim, a soul purified by sacrifice. Even death, they were told, was not the end. It was just the final toll paid on the path to paradise. Local powers quickly learned to take advantage of this constant stream of vulnerable travelers. Bandits operated freely along the roads, knowing full well that pilgrims driven by desperation would keep moving forward no matter the risk. Towns implemented special taxes just for those wearing the pilgrim's badge. Merchants inflated prices on food and water. Every corner of society found a way to profit from the suffering of the faithful, and at the center of it all was the church, now operating a vast infrastructure designed to extract as much wealth as possible from these spiritual journeys. Vendors of indulgences set up along every major route, selling everything from forgiveness of minor transgressions to full absolution for a price. Relic dealers peddled mysterious artifacts of dubious origin at enormous cost. Blessing rituals now came with mandatory donations. Even the most basic prayers were accompanied by suggested offerings. That felt far from optional, but perhaps the most chilling invention was something called pilgrimage insurance, of fee paid in advance to ensure that if a pilgrim died en route, the church would pray for their soul. This grim financial product became yet another source of income, marketed as essential protection against spiritual oblivion. Families already drained by the cost of the journey were pressured into paying even more to guarantee peace for their loved one, dead or alive. The cost in human lives was catastrophic. Eyewitness accounts describe the roads lined with bodies, entire families swallowed by forests and mountains, never to return. Children were left orphaned, husbands disappeared, wives buried their hopes along the trail. But rather than reassess the danger, the church dug in, further insisting that such loss only proved the depth of Christian devotion, that the suffering was sacred, the pain was necessary. For women, the nightmare was even worse. Many were forced to travel without male relatives, leaving them exposed to every imaginable threat. Abuse was rampant. Church archives, when they chose to document such incidents, mention assault, captivity, and even killings as disturbingly common occurrences. But instead of offering help or protection, church leaders often blamed the women themselves. Tragedy, they said, was the punishment for unspoken sins. By the 1300s, the death toll had become so accepted that entire economies emerged around it. Towns on major pilgrimage routes survived solely by serving those fated never to finish the journey. Grave diggers, coffin builders, and hired mourners formed trade guilds to handle the constant influx of death. Even the roads were constructed with the expectation that many would not live to see the end. Pilgrimage, once a symbol of hope and faith, had become almost indistinguishable from a death sentence. Families sent their loved ones off as if to war, writing wills and saying final goodbyes. Children grew up knowing that their parents might leave at any time, summoned by some spiritual decree that felt more like execution than salvation. And yet this machine of sorrow kept running, feeding on grief to generate more victims. When someone died on pilgrimage, their family would often undertake a second journey to pray for their soul, spending more money, enduring more danger, and feeding the cycle. Sorrow became a form of spiritual currency. The church collected every coin. This wasn't just tragic, it was a perversion of everything Christianity claimed to be. A faith built on love and redemption had become a business that thrived on loss. An institution that promised eternal life had constructed a system fueled by death. The church had mastered the art of cloaking cruelty in sacred language. Its coffers swelled while its followers withered. The pilgrimage system, by this point, had become something far more horrifying than mere corruption. It was an organized campaign of spiritual and physical exploitation, one that operated for centuries. Unchecked and unchallenged, pilgrimage had once been an act of devotion. Now, it was a revenue stream, trap disguised as a holy journey. Picture a midnight landscape in medieval Scotland. Church bells toll softly in the distance. Somewhere out there, another pilgrim is walking alone through the mist-tired cold, and certain that their suffering is a sign of divine approval. They don't know they've been caught in a system too large to escape, one where every step brings them closer to a grave and further from the peace they were promised. Every mile of every route had been monetized. Every shrine had been transformed into a toll booth. Every whispered prayer became part of a transaction. The church had realized something devastating, that human despair was profitable. If properly managed, it could be harvested again and again. The infrastructure surrounding these death marches was vast. Professional partners traveled the countryside like peddlers, selling indulgences from leather satchels. These men, many of whom had bought their titles, carried pre-written scrolls offering forgiveness at set prices. A common sin cost a day's wages. More serious offenses could bankrupt an entire household. But the church had studied its market. The prices were high enough to hurt, but always just low enough to be paid by the desperate. Meanwhile, the relic trade had grown into a grotesque mockery of faith. Every abbey and church claimed to house a piece of the divine. Enough wood from the true cross circulated to build an entire fleet of ships. John the Baptist's skull could be found in at least a dozen different cities, claiming theirs was the original. Bottled milk of the Virgin Mary was sold in crystal vials by the hundreds. One could even pay to touch the supposed chains of St. Peter or weep beside a vial said to contain Christ's own tears. All for the right price. And then there was pilgrim insurance, the church's most morbid invention. Before leaving, pilgrims were encouraged or outright required to purchase spiritual coverage. These documents, blessed by bishops and sealed with ornate wax, guaranteed prayers for the soul in case of death. If the journey killed them, the church would fast-track their spirit to heaven. The cost of these policies varied depending on the danger of the route, the age and health of the traveler, and most critically their wealth. But what the faithful didn't know was this: the church had no intention of honoring these promises. The money was taken, the documents were archived, and when the pilgrim inevitably died, the family received little more than empty condolences and ritual words. Their payment had already been folded into funds for cathedral construction and clerical luxuries. These policies weren't protection, they were extraction, a final theft at the edge of death. The last few coins, taken from hands that would soon be buried, what began as a spiritual practice had evolved into something unthinkable, a vast, well-oiled enterprise designed to exploit fear, sell hope, and profit from death. The system was so refined, so normalized, that most never questioned it. They believed it was holy. They believed it was necessary. And in doing so, they became part of it. The church had done more than just fail its people. It had turned faith itself into a weapon. And with that weapon, it carved out an empire built on bones. The church's manipulation reached a level of sophistication that, to modern eyes, borders on the diabolical. Sermons were no longer just calls to faith, they became finely tuned instruments of psychological terror. Clergy delivered descriptions of hell so vivid, so agonizing, that congregants would flee the sanctuary in tears. The message was clear: endure the suffering of pilgrimage, face unending torment in the afterlife. Children were not spared. In one of the most tragic chapters of medieval religious history, the church actively promoted what became known as the Children's Crusades. Young boys and girls, some no older than 7, were told that their innocence could perform miracles, that their purity would part the Mediterranean Sea, just as Moses had parted the Red Sea, that they would march straight into Jerusalem, unarmed, and be welcomed as holy deliverers. Thousands answered the call. They carried wooden crosses, sang hymns. They believed with unshakable faith that their journey was ordained by God, but few ever made it past the coastline. Many starved or succumbed to illness. Others were betrayed by merchants who had promised free passage, only to sell them into slavery once they arrived at port. These children were not protected by the church. They were sacrificed as spiritual currency in a system that fed on belief and repaid it with betrayal, even in times of disaster. The church found ways to convert crisis into opportunity. When famine struck, when plagues ravaged villages, when war tore through the countryside, religious leaders framed it all as divine punishment for a lack of piety. The solution, they proclaimed, was more pilgrimage, more sacrifice, more suffering. Entire villages emptied as residents rushed toward distant shrines, abandoning homes, livelihoods, and loved ones. The logic was brutal but effective. Appease God by suffering now, or suffer forever after death. The pilgrimage routes themselves had become traps dangerous by design. The church had more than enough resources to make these paths safer. But safety would have decreased the tolls, the lodging costs, the fees for armed escorts, the bribes for safe passage. So bridges remained broken, forcing travelers to pay outrageous fees for ferries. Roads went unmarked, guiding pilgrims into the wilderness where they would be forced to hire costly guides or vanish. Bandits operated with near impunity, especially in areas where the church had indirect control. Their violence kept pilgrims fearful, and fear made them spend more. In some regions, ecclesiastical authorities even sold safe conduct documents, official-looking papers that offered no real protection but carried a hefty price tag. It was security theater in its most cynical form. Even basic accommodations became tools of exploitation. Church run-ins charged exorbitant rates for straw mats on stone floors. Food was overpriced and often inedible. Water sources were fouled, yet sold at premium rates as blessed or purified. And for the sick or dying, charges only increased. Some inns and hospices billed pilgrims for the privilege of dying on sanctified ground. Burial in consecrated soil came with its own inflated price tag, especially cruel irony given that many pilgrims had already paid to have their souls prayed for in the event of their deaths. And still, The cruelty did not end there. Women faced dangers that were not just tolerated by the church, but institutionalized. One of the darkest developments was the invention of temporary marriages. Under these arrangements, male pilgrims or church officials could pay for short-term unions, which were blessed by corrupt clergy and treated as legitimate. In reality, they were thinly veiled forms of religiously sanctioned exploitation. Women who refused to participate in these arrangements often found themselves cast out, stripped of protection or provisions, abandoned in dangerous territory. Those who survived spoke of being left to face the wilderness alone, prey to both nature and man. Few made it home. Perhaps most grotesque of all was the church's development of a suffering economy, theological justification for turning pain into a commodity. Wealthy patrons were encouraged to sponsor impoverished pilgrims, especially on the most dangerous routes. The theory, promoted by church theologians, was that the suffering of the poor could be transferred spiritually to benefit the rich. That agony, when purchased, could become a tool for absolution. The result was a booming market in human misery. Routes with the highest death tolls fetched the most money. Poor families were incentivized, pressured to send loved ones into known danger, just so their pain could purchase salvation for a noble or merchant too comfortable to travel themselves. As these systems grew more elaborate, the church encountered a new problem. They were running out of pilgrims. The death rates had become too high, the exploitation too visible. Even the devout were beginning to question whether these journeys truly served God or merely served those in power. Communities that had once emptied into the roads to Compostela or Rome began resisting the call. Mothers who had lost 2 or 3 children a pilgrimage refused to risk another. Fathers who had seen entire families vanish began to speak out. The illusion that this was sacred suffering was starting to crack. Stories spread of children sold into slavery, mass graves outside shrines, of miracles that never came. And with these stories came a shift. Quiet at first, but growing people began to whisper that this wasn't divine, that it couldn't be, that perhaps what they were seeing wasn't wholly at all but predatory, and yet church did not yield. Faced with dwindling numbers and growing skepticism, it doubled down. Pilgrimages were no longer encouraged, they were commanded. Courts handed down journeys as sentences, penance became punishment. Refusal was seen not as caution, but as heresy. The logic remained twisted but effective. If people were reluctant to sacrifice themselves voluntarily, then the church would force their hand in God's name. By now, the institution had evolved into something far removed from its original mission. The church had ceased to be a shepherd guiding lost souls. It had become a machine, one engineered to extract wealth from faith, to convert suffering into silver, to refine belief into institutional power. This wasn't just moral failure. It was spiritual betrayal. The legacy of medieval pilgrimage, once rooted in sacred devotion, had curdled into something monstrous. The trails once walked in search of grace now led to ruin. The shrines once revered as places of healing had become engines of death, and the church, cloaked in the garments of holiness, stood at the center of it all, profiting not just from the bodies of the dead but from the hopes of the living. In the end, what they built was not a path to paradise. It was a road paved in desperation and lit by false promises, a road that countless innocents walked with trust in their hearts, and nothing waiting for them but suffering. And behind them, the echo of bells, not calling them home, but ringing in the next wave of the faithful, already being prepared for harvest. But the church's manipulation of pilgrimage desperation reached even darker depths through what would come to be known as the proxy pilgrimage trade. It began as a convenience, a way for the wealthy to fulfill their spiritual obligations without enduring the physical toll of long, hazardous travel. Nobles too aged or infirm, merchants too consumed with business, or simply those too comfortable to leave the safety of their estates were offered a solution. The church assured them, you need not walk the road yourself. Hire someone to walk it for you. The blessings will be yours just the same. At first glance, it appeared almost merciful, a union of need and charity. The rich got their salvation, and the poor received a payment that might mean food, shelter, or temporary escape from crushing poverty. But as with all things touched by the medieval church's machinery of exploitation, what began as optional quickly became systemic. Soon, the church recognized the vast potential of this system not as a spiritual arrangement, but as a commercial opportunity. Why settle for the coin of one pilgrim when you could collect from two or more? In time, church officials transformed proxy pilgrimage into an industry. The poor were no longer just pilgrims. They became products. Church agents, often operating under the guise of charity, would visit debtor prisons, poorhouses, and plague-stricken villages. There, they scouted for candidates, desperate men and women with nothing left to lose. Individuals whose deaths would not provoke questions or consequences. They offered hope salvation wrapped in contracts. A generous sum up front, often enough, to temporarily clear debts or feed one's children. In return, the desperate soul would undertake a pilgrimage on behalf of a wealthy patron. But behind this appearance of divine opportunity lay a brutal calculus. The church had begun quietly tracking survival rates. Elderly widows, single mothers with infants, laborers recovering from injury, the malnourished. Pilgrim sand, therefore highly profitable. The less likely a proxy was to survive, the better the church's margins. If they died en route, their payment was already secured. There would be no need to deliver on promises of post-journey blessings or fulfillment of contract. Death in this system was the optimal outcome, and if the proxy did survive, there were always additional services to upsell, additional indulgences, final absolution, fees for delivering proof to the sponsor, more coins extracted, more blood turned into silver. This evolution of pilgrimage into spiritual outsourcing further degraded the core of the faith it claimed to serve. The idea that one could purchase another's suffering to cleanse their own soul turned salvation into a kind of sacrificial economics, where the poor quite literally died so that the rich could live guilt-free. As demand increased, so did supply soon. Entire guilds of professional pilgrims emerged, bands of impoverished men and women who made their living by walking these death routes repeatedly, each time carrying the sins of another. Church officials even began to stack contracts assigning multiple spiritual burdens to a single body. One man might walk to Santiago de Compostela, carrying the redemptive hopes of 10 or 12 nobles, all of whom had paid for exclusive proxy rights. The human toll was staggering. These proxies overburdened, undernourished, and spiritually exhausted often succumbed to disease, exposure, or violence on the road. Yet there was no outrage, no memorial. The church viewed these deaths as a kind of sacred attrition, a necessary turnover rate in the business of buying grace. But it didn't stop there. As public awareness of the deadly nature of physical pilgrimage grew, even the devout began to hesitate. People feared the Rodond, rightfully so. But instead of addressing the horrors they'd built, the church pivoted again, creating yet another tier of monetized mysticism. They called it the mental pilgrimage. Here was the promise. You could now experience the full spiritual benefits of pilgrimage without ever leaving your home. Church-trained confessors would guide believers through a vivid mental reenactment of the journey, using relics, sacred music, incense, and holy objects to simulate the path to salvation. Devotees would be led to imagine crossing perilous bridges, surviving ambushes, beholding the relics at sacred shrines, all in the quiet of their own chapel or room. But of course, it wasn't free. Mental pilgrimage required training sessions, special relics to anchor the experience, blessed candles, authorized meditative scrolls, guidance fees paid to priests for each spiritual checkpoint passed, and always donations to ensure the vision took in the eyes of God. These internal journeys were sold as safer, more enlightened alternatives. But in truth, they were simply more cost-efficient for the church. No need to worry about lost bodies, missing payments, or mass graves. The faithful were now the ones doing the heavy lifting spiritually and financially. While never leaving the church's physical grasp, by the late Middle Ages, pilgrimage had become a multi-tiered industry, operating at local, national, and continental scales. had revenue streams for every class of believer. The rich could buy salvation wholesale through sponsorships. The middle classes could send a son or daughter on the road or opt for mental pilgrimage. The poor could sell their suffering or gamble their lives outright for a few coins more. What had once been an act of devotion had now become an industrial process. And like all industries, it had infrastructure, agents, marketing, risk assessment, fraud, logistics. The pilgrimage economy dwarfed the treasuries of many kingdoms. Its revenues built cathedrals, funded crusades, paid for papal feasts, and courtly intrigue. The blood of pilgrims, both literal and symbolic, soaked the stones of the Holy Roman Empire, of France, of England. Entire nations were built on the backs of spiritual desperation. Perhaps the most chilling realization is this: the system worked only because the victims believed in it. The faithful volunteered for slaughter, carried the burdens of others. They paid for their own exploitation. And when it failed, when a journey ended in death, when a cure never came, they blamed themselves. Not the road, not the church. Themselves. This internalization of guilt, this weaponized faith, was the true genius of the church's death machine. The suffering wasn't just endured, was sanctified, made holy, offered back to the very institution that had engineered it, like lambs offering themselves to the knife. And the church, knowing this, doubled down. It declared suffering to be redemptive, poverty to be holy, and death on the road to be the ultimate act of devotion. This wasn't just manipulation. This was the systematic redefinition of salvation itself, turning what should have been a spiritual journey into a glorified human harvest. By the end of the Middle Ages, pilgrimage was no longer about faith. It was about profit. It was about control. It was about how deeply you could burrow into the psyche of a desperate soul and convince them that their suffering was not only righteous, but required in that sense. The church had achieved something few institutions ever do: total control over both life and death. And as long as people believed that their agony was meaningful, that their deaths were holy, that their poverty was sacred, there would always be more pilgrims, always more roads, always more silver, always more blood. But perhaps the most chilling revelation about the church's proxy pilgrimage system wasn't its brutality, it was its efficiency. By the late medieval period, vulnerability itself had become currency. The more fragile a proxy pilgrim, the more valuable their suffering became. Church agents, acting as both recruiters and brokers, began to calculate spiritual merit using crude yet disturbingly precise metrics: age, health, expected mortality rate by region and season. A frail widow sent to Santiago de Compostela during winter earned more spiritual return than a strong man sent in spring. Martyrdom, measured to the decimal. Wealthy sponsors were encouraged to select the weakest proxies, not out of charity, but because the death of the proxy was now framed as a perfect sacrifice. It was theological accounting at its most grotesque: pay in gold. Receive redemption and watch as someone else dies in your stead. Church contracts formalized this wicked economy. Detailed parchments preserved in monastery archives across Europe spell out the transaction in chilling legalese. Patrons absolved of any responsibility. Proxies guaranteed no protection. Payments funneled through church banks, often with clauses ensuring that if a proxy failed to complete the journey due to illness, injury, or death, the spiritual benefit would still be fully delivered to the sponsor. The proxy's fate was irrelevant. Only the transaction mattered. In many cases, proxies were issued letters of credit that could only be redeemed in full if they reached designated holy sites. These were intentionally placed at great distances and in treacherous terrain. Should the proxy die before arrival, as most did, the unclaimed funds reverted back to the church. This ensured that only partial payments were made to the poor, while full sums were extracted from the rich. Some of the most horrifying arrangements came in the form of family proxies. Impoverished parents, often facing starvation, would sell the pilgrimage services of their own children. The church claimed that a child's purity increased the spiritual reward, making them ideal vessels for proxy salvation. There are surviving records of boys as young as 8 and girls as young as 6 being sent on deadly journeys alone across war-torn lands or pestilence-ridden paths. The church promoted these arrangements with sacred language. Little saints in waiting, they called them. In reality, they were sacrifices holy in name, but abandoned in practice. And still, the death toll wasn't enough. Criminal elements quickly saw opportunity in this trade of bodies for blessings. Gangs posing as pilgrimage brokers began, offering fraudulent proxy services. They collected gold from patrons and either abandoned their proxies in hostile regions or murdered them outright, ensuring the church's paperwork would never be challenged, because death was not only common, but expected. No one asked questions. There were no investigations, no consequences. And in some cases, church officials themselves colluded with these networks. The line between spiritual authority and organized murder was no longer blurred. It was gone by the 14th century. Bishops were offering bulk proxy packages, dozens, even hundreds of poor pilgrims rounded up from debtor prisons. Leper colonies or famine-struck villages and sent en masse pilgrimages where survival was not just unlikely, it was undesired. These became known informally as processions of the damned. Few returned, the ones who did physically maimed, emotionally shattered, and spiritually discarded, found no welcome waiting. Their families, having long since spent the initial payment, could not support them. Their communities regarded them with suspicion or contempt. The church had no further use for them. They had already delivered the salvation product to their buyers. These survivors often suffered from what we would now call post-traumatic stress night terrors, hallucinations, breakdowns. Some wandered aimlessly for years, unable to process the depth of the betrayal. It suffered at the hands of the very institution they had trusted with their lives. The psychological wreckage was as vast as the physical, and yet the machine kept running, because behind the horrors was a business model so effective, so scalable, that it became self-sustaining. The more proxies that died, the more grieving families paid the church to pray for their souls. Masses, indulgences, special blessings. Make sure your loved one's soul is lifted from purgatory. Pay again. Again. This created a perpetual cycle of monetized death. Pilgrimage was no longer about journey or even faith. It had become a harvesting operation. Each death generated more revenue. Each grief-fueled transaction became a referral mechanism for new customers. The church's death engine now had full vertical integration. They supplied the pilgrims, designed the routes, controlled the services, managed the deaths, and processed the aftermath. The corpses of dead proxies were stripped of valuables, their documents archived, and their meager belongings sold in church-run blessed bazaars. Surviving items were sanctified and resold: shoes, rosaries, even bone fragments, creating a feedback loop of sanctified commerce. Entire monasteries were established to house and sort the property of the dead. Some of these became little more than medieval warehouses of sorrow, where shelves lined with pilgrim packs and personal effects bore silent witness to the scale of the suffering. But the church was not done. It wanted to squeeze more value from the dying, and so it resurrected an old doctrine: vicarious suffering. This new theology claimed that the pain endured by one person could be transferred, donated to another. Proxies, therefore, weren't just carrying spiritual obligations. They were carrying pain quotas. Every mile walked in agony, every fever suffered, every wound left untreated wasn't a failure. It was spiritual currency, deposited on behalf of the sponsor. Soon, church scholars began assigning measurable values to suffering. A day without food equaled a week off purgatory. A bleeding foot? A soul elevated past one rung of divine judgment. Death by exposure. Instant heaven, and for the right price. Sponsors could claim these spiritual dividends, but it wasn't only the patrons who were being manipulated. Proxies themselves were indoctrinated to believe that their deaths were acts of holiness. Sermons, chants, and church literature emphasized the honor of dying for another's soul. Suicidal self-sacrifice became sanctified. Many proxy pilgrims departed with joy in their hearts, believing they had been chosen not to die in misery, but to die for purpose. In this way, the church made the exploited complicit in their own annihilation. They didn't just consent to their suffering, they glorified it. They praised the church, thanked it, prayed for the opportunity to be chosen again, even as they lay dying. Meanwhile, local priests, bishops, and abbots grew wealthy off blood. They received kickbacks for rooting pilgrims down known deadly paths. Tavern owners and innkeepers inflated prices for food and water, knowing pilgrims had nowhere else to go. Safe roads were deliberately neglected to force travelers onto treacherous routes where escort services could be sold at extortionate rates. Many of these religious officials sworn to guide souls became merchants of calculated death. They manipulated, extorted, and lied. They tracked performance metrics, noting which paths produced the highest mortality rates and recommending them to new waves of pilgrims to maximize spiritual return. They had turned martyrdom into a science, and they had the paperwork to prove it. Archived monastery ledgers from this period are filled with tallies: who left, who returned, who died where. It's not out of compassion or duty, but out of fiscal prudence. Marginalia in these documents show preferences for routes that yielded consistent attrition or maximized suffering within budget constraints. It was genocide by spreadsheet, sanctified slaughter, murder under the banner of divine grace. And through it all, the church claimed to be the very embodiment of God's love on earth. By the end of the 14th century, the church's exploitation of pilgrimage had become so complete, so refined, that its final innovation felt less like a new invention and more like a brutal culmination. The inevitable endpoint of centuries spent perfecting the sacred machinery of mass murder. That innovation was called graduated absolution. It was marketed as a logical refinement of existing doctrine. A divine hierarchy of sin required a corresponding hierarchy of sacrifice. Minor sins, lying, stealing, impure thoughts could be cleansed by visiting a local relic or attending Mass at a nearby cathedral. But mortal sins, adultery, heresy, apostasy demanded something greater. They required a journey of risk, of pain, of death. The church had invented a spiritual economy in which danger became the currency of redemption. And in doing so, they found a terrifyingly efficient way to purge the most undesirable members of society under the pretense of salvation. This wasn't a suggestion. It was policy. Official church proclamations issued by bishops and papal delegates clearly outlined which sins required which journeys. A woman accused of fornication might be sent to the snow-covered cliffs of St. Olaf in Norway. A debtor convicted of usury could find himself assigned to Jerusalem during a plague outbreak. A rebellious serf who spoke against the church's authority might be ordered to make pilgrimage to the crumbling ruins of Antioch. Through bandit-filled deserts, the more damned you were, the more likely you were to die, and that was the point. What made graduated absolution particularly horrifying was the way it weaponized hope. These weren't executions by sword or fire. They were acts of faith, voluntary in appearance, lethal by design. Pilgrims, terrified of the hellfire so vividly painted in church sermons, begged to be allowed to undertake these death marches. They believed the pain was cleansing. They believed the church's calculus of mercy. They didn't understand that their death was the objective. The system worked with terrifying precision. Parish priests were instructed to assess each sinner's offense and recommend a tiered pilgrimage. Based on its severity, bishops approved or modified these assignments according to quotas. Quotas ensured a steady stream of expendable pilgrims were sent along the most dangerous routes at all times of year. Monastic scribes tallied the sins, assigned the punishments, processed the paperwork with bureaucratic detachment. Some pilgrims tried to protest. Families petitioned for safer alternatives. Communities pleaded for leniency. But the church had an answer for every objection. If your loved one's soul was truly in danger, why would you not send them on the most spiritually effective journey? Why would you withhold salvation? Guilt became the church's most powerful weapon. Entire families collapsed under the weight of it.
Oh.
Parents watched their sons walk into deserts from which no one returned. Widows kissed their daughters goodbye, and watched them vanish into mountain passes, known for their death tolls. The church offered no refunds, no explanations. Just prayers and the promise of salvation in exchange for sacrifice, graduated absolution. Also offered a new opportunity for social control. The church now possessed a spiritual sentencing systema, means of condemning heretics, blasphemers, or political enemies to death without ever drawing a blade. No more inquisitions. No more public executions. Just carefully assigned pilgrimages, from which there was no return. The accused would appear before an ecclesiastical tribunal, confess to their sins, and be granted the chance to redeem themselves. They were praised for their humility, applauded for their faith, and then sent to die. Records from Avignon and Cologne revealed cases where local landowners who resisted tithes were found guilty of spiritual pride and ordered to make pilgrimage. 2. Pestilence struck Constantinople. A village healer accused of heresy was sent to Jerusalem during a famine, without food or escort. A teenage boy who refused to enlist in a crusading order was condemned to walk barefoot across the Alps in winter to reach a remote mountain chapel. These weren't punishments. They were cleansings, and the church grew rich from every step. Each level of absolution required fees, initial assessments, travel blessings, equipment, sanctified guides, absolution certificates, burials. The church built an entire pricing structure around these death journeys, ensuring that even if a pilgrim died en route, the institution profited from the preparation, the passage, and the prayers purchased afterward. It became common for pilgrims to sign absolution bonds, financial contracts that mortgaged their family land to pay for their forgiveness. If the pilgrim died, the land became church property. If they returned, they were often destitute, having purchased their souls at the cost of everything else. Graduated absolution also became the foundation for a thriving spiritual black market. Wealthy elites began paying underdated bull bribes. To avoid the most dangerous routes, corrupt priests sold forged documents indicating that dangerous journeys had been completed. Pilgrim forgers created fake relics, false travelogues, and invented martyrdom stories to prove they had fulfilled their spiritual sentence. The church tolerated this corruption so long as the money kept flowing. Some officials even facilitated it, ensuring that the most profitable pilgrims received just enough protection to complete their journeys and return to pay further tithes. The most damning evidence of the church's full descent into spiritual tyranny comes from a series of classified route maps uncovered centuries later in sealed Vatican archives. These maps, carefully drawn and annotated, show detailed calculations of pilgrim attrition rates by region, season, and demographic. Marginal notes recommend which routes are best for quiet removals. It's a chilling euphemism for sacrificial pilgrimage assignments. Even natural disasters became tools in this holy calculus. After reports of an avalanche destroying part of the Mont Saint-Michel path, a bishop in Brittany remarked that the route is now perfect for absolving the deeply corrupted. So that wasn't a metaphor. It was logistics. Behind closed doors, the church no longer pretended this was about faith. Letters between high-ranking cardinals speak candidly about managing the spiritual surplus, a euphemism for eliminating those deemed burdens on church resources or influence. Too many mouths, not enough altars, wrote one abbot in 1412. Send them west. The coastal storms will do the rest. Even sainthood became a weapon in this system. Stories of proxy pilgrims and absolution martyrs were carefully curated, canonized, and retold with miraculous embellishment. Their deaths were framed as triumphs of divine love. Their suffering became tourist attractions. Shrines were built, relics sold. Churches expanded. Sanctified murder became church branding, and still, the people came. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, the masses continued to believe, because the system wasn't just economic, it was psychological. The sermons never stopped. The art, the music, the stained glass stories all told the same tale. Suffering saves, death redeems, pilgrimage prives. It was a spiritual Stockholm syndrome. The victims thanked their executioners. They donated to the very institutions that sent them to die. They urged their children to walk the same roads, because to question the pilgrimage system was to question the church, and to question the church was to risk becoming the next name on the death list. They had learned to read human desperation with the skill of a master manipulator. Every plea for mercy, every whispered confession, every trembling act of faith was not seen as a soul reaching toward heaven, but as a resource to be mined, a weakness to be monetized, a life to be extinguished. In monastery after monastery, ledgers like Brother Matthias's filled libraries of death, names, ages, roots, symptoms, time of death, all recorded with the same dispassionate tone used for inventorying livestock. The only annotations of interest came beside the cause of death, where phrases like expected, acceptable, or ideal return were scribbled in the margins. This wasn't merely documentation. It was refinement, a constant optimization of the machinery of holy genocide. The death rates had become predictable, even calibrated. And those who managed the system were no longer ashamed of what they'd built. In internal memos passed between high-ranking abbots and bishops, many preserved in church archives, one phrase begins to appear with disturbing frequency: blessed attrition. It was used to describe pilgrimage routes that consistently returned high death rates with minimal complaints. The phrase became code for efficiency, for purity of purpose, for perfect compliance between doctrine and death. There was no longer any pretense of salvation. The pilgrimage had become a ritualized slaughterhouse, wrapped in scripture, bound in parchment, and consecrated with holy water. The church didn't just allow this system, it relied on it. The revenues generated from these pilgrimages dwarfed those of kings and emperors. Cathedrals that rose like mountains from stone were funded not by grace but by grief. The blood money of murdered pilgrims flowed into papal treasuries, underwriting wars, building palaces, and silencing dissent. Even the papal court itself became entwined in the pilgrimage machine. Popes began granting mass absolution bonds, documents, which allowed nobility to pre-purchase salvation for entire families, entire estates, even entire generations. These indulgences were tied directly to proxy pilgrimages. The more proxies you sponsored, the more divine favor you could bank. The more suffering you caused, the more glory you inherited. The logic became inescapable. The path to heaven was paved with the bodies of the poor, yet it was the system's completeness that made it most terrifying. Every piece of infrastructure was aligned: the roads, the sermons, the monasteries, the markets, the theology, from recruitment to ruin, from coin to corpse. The church had constructed a seamless pipeline of piety and death. Pilgrims were processed like sacrificial offerings. Their bodies fed into the machinery. Their deaths fed the treasury. Their stories fed the myth, and no part of it functioned without the devout cooperation of the victims. That was the system's most brilliant cruelty. It taught people to love their executioners, to praise the architects of their misery, to believe that the more they suffered, the closer they were to God. By the end of the 15th century, there were pilgrims who asked to die. They begged to be sent on the most dangerous routes. They wept with joy when assigned to paths known for starvation, plague, or violence. Children were raised to view proxy martyrdom as the highest possible honor a poor family could achieve. And yet, the church was not immortal. The Renaissance brought cracks to the foundation questions the system could not answer. Humanist scholars began to recover ancient texts that emphasized compassion over cruelty, knowledge over superstition, reason over ritual murder. Whispers of rebellion spread in markets and university halls, calling into question the basic morality of a faith that consumed its most faithful. The Protestant Reformation would soon ignite like wildfire. But by then, the damage had been done. The great pilgrimage routes were scarred with unmarked graves. Forests whispered with the footsteps of the forgotten. Mountains bore witness to endless lines of the desperate, marching toward a death they believed was sacred. Entire villages had vanished. Generations wiped away. Not by disease or conquest, but by the deliberate policy of a church that viewed suffering as currency. Even today, the memory remains buried under centuries of historical whitewash. Modern accounts often frame pilgrimage as quaint tradition, devout, noble, inspiring. But beneath the myths lie the bones of millions, sacrificed not to God, but to greed. The scale is almost incomprehensible. Demographic records from England, France, Italy, and the Germanic states suggest that some regions lost up to 15% of their populations directly to church-sanctioned pilgrimage attrition. And in regions where pilgrimage was imposed generationally, like under the hereditary absolution system, entire bloodlines simply ceased to exist. This was not collateral damage. This was policy. We call it the Age of Faith. But it was also the age of sanctified murder. And now, at the end of this journey, we must confront the final horror. It worked. The church achieved exactly what it set out to do. It eliminated its political enemies. It silenced dissent. It crushed independence. It rewrote theology into a tool of control so perfect, so all-encompassing, that the victims themselves became its most loyal enforcers. And in doing so, it held absolute power over the most intimate of human experiences: faith, guilt, salvation. Death, the medieval pilgrimage system, was not an accident. It was not a corruption of something noble. It was the logical endpoint of an institution that saw no line between domination and devotion. It is perhaps history's greatest example of how power unchecked, unquestioned, and sanctified can take the holiest instincts of a people and turn them into weapons against themselves. The victims prayed as they were murdered. They thanked the church as it devoured them. They blessed the hands that broke them, and the church grew fat on the feast of their souls. That is the story of medieval pilgrimage, not a path to holiness, but a highway of bones, not a journey of salvation, but an industry of death, not a testament to faith, but a warning to the world. Beware those who claim to speak for God, especially when they demand your life in return. They knew precisely which pilgrims to select: the terminally ill, the elderly, the mentally unstable, and those unwanted by their own families. These were not random wanderers, but hand-picked targets chosen through a system honed over generations. Disguised as compassionate clergy, church operatives approached grieving relatives with offers cloaked in divine grace, offers that were, in reality, calculated death sentences. The manipulation was astonishing in its sophistication. Church agents struck at moments of peak vulnerability: a dying loved one, crushing poverty, or looming disgrace. They spoke solemnly of holy shrines and miraculous healings of cripples. Walking, the blind seeing, sinners cleansed. But their tales were deliberate fabrications meant to exploit desperation. They never intended for these pilgrims to return. The structure was designed to maximize profits while eliminating evidence. Travel routes were selected not for safety, for danger mountain passes in deadly seasons, trails through bandit territory, and paths infested with disease. A web of corrupt innkeepers, guides, and local officials supported the operation. They were paid to ensure no pilgrim survived. Some offered tainted food or led travelers into ambushes. Others ignored the dead left along roadsides. Methods of murder varied from abandonment to poison to staged accidents. Bandits were even given shares of the profits in return for their services. What was most chilling was the system's bureaucratic precision. The church kept detailed records tracking recruitment, deaths, preferred killing methods, and financial yields. Victims' bodies were hidden or destroyed, their belongings cataloged and sold, adding to the institution's wealth. Families seeking answers were fed scripted lies of noble deaths and fictional heroism. To prevent remorse among their agents, church rotated clergy and offered theological justifications, claiming they were granting faster passage to heaven. This wasn't just murder. It was mass-scale genocide wrapped in ritual and holiness. Tens of thousands died, perhaps hundreds of thousands. The church leveraged its control over spiritual, legal, and political systems to silence any opposition. Judges were handpicked. Laws were tailored to protect ecclesiastical power. and investigators were destroyed through excommunication. Faith itself had become a weapon. Seeking salvation could now mean certain death. Sacred journey had turned into a mechanism of extermination. As secular powers rose and the medieval period waned, this deadly practice began to unravel. But by then, the devastation was irreversible. Bloodlines lost, communities destroyed, and pilgrimage forever tainted. This was not merely a medieval tragedy. It was one of history's most chilling examples of institutional evil masquerading. As moral guidance, the Church had perfected the art of cloaking murder in mercy, converting suffering into wealth. Victims were not noble martyrs, but human lives sacrificed on the altar of greed and power. Their memories deserve justice, not silence. This episode warns us, any institution, when left unchecked, can become a vehicle for exploitation. The medieval pilgrimage industry's descent into murder is a stark reminder of how easily ideals can be corrupted. It forces us to confront the uneasy truth. The line between salvation and cruelty can vanish when power goes unquestioned. As history moved on, the Church's deadly system eventually collapsed under its own weight. Yet its legacy persists as a warning that even the most revered institutions must be held accountable. The story of these lost pilgrims is not just about the past, but about the timeless human struggle between light and darkness. They must be remembered not as statistics, but as lives betrayed by those they trusted most.